idea of riding bicycles around the world was just a dream to us in 1978. When the dream became reality, we called our expedition the Tyred Tour. The very first step the three of us took on this around-the-world bicycle tour was to take a long, hard look, individually, into our souls and consider what it meant to give up what was familiar, our family, our friends, our community, and set off into the unknown.
We realized from the beginning that each of us would have to make a commitment to doing this project. It was really a commitment to each other that once we started, we would continue until we finished it, no matter what got in our way and what we had to do in order to complete the around-the-world tour.
I think the main motivating factor for me is that I'm innately curious about everything, and it's always been something that has propelled me from one adventure to the next.
We could have chosen a more direct route around the world, but our goal was to traverse all 6 inhabited continents. We designed our route in stages. Stage 1, Jackson Hole to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Stage 2, Cape Town to Cairo. Stage 3, Gibraltar to Muscat, Oman. Stage 4, Karachi to Kunming and Singapore. Stage 5, Perth to Sydney, Australia. And when times did get hard, from crossing the frozen Nevada desert to chopping through the world's densest jungle, or traversing the roadless Sudan, to surviving a landslide in the Tibetan Plateau, we relied on that commitment we made when we began our grand adventure back in our small mountain community of Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
We found that when we were planning this tour that a lot of the materials that we needed to get on the road weren't available commercially, so we designed and built a lot of this. We chose the tubes for our bicycle frame, choosing quality chromoly tubing. We chose Cordura material to make the panniers out of, and we chose chromoly to make the racks out of, and we handpicked every component on the bicycle because we needed something that would go the distance, and we knew it was going to be a tough trip.
Well, leaving was such a shock to the body because we really hadn't had much training, and it was cold in the middle of the winter in Wyoming. But as we crossed Idaho into Utah and Nevada, we started working out little details of where to pack things, which drove me nuts for a couple of weeks because I kept losing things in pockets, always looking for a more efficient way to pack the bike and to have gear available to me whenever I needed it. And by the time we got to the California coast, not only were we physically in shape and comfortable with our lifestyle, but we had all these little tricks organized.
Our travels through Mexico, starting down the Baja and then carrying over from Cabo San Lucas to the mainland, were interesting for one reason especially. None of us knew any Spanish.
So the school, the Spanish language school, was on the road, in the marketplace, from the people who would stop us in their cars and ask us who we were, where we were going. And a big project was studying and learning Spanish day by day, especially when you got hungry. You get very inventive with your actions and your charades in order to get what you want.
Tim, Peter, and myself had all been involved in competitive sports, and we had a very gung-ho spirit about the speed and the pace of our day-to-day activities. And riding up to 3 hours in a stretch, we'd always manage to cover the distance but find ourselves so exhausted at the end of the day that the exhaustion would carry over into the next morning. We ended up taking a look at the number of hours of daylight and then divided those into what we would call sets. A set would be 1.5 hours to 2 hours on the bike with a half an hour break to 45 minutes for water, food, stretching, and sometimes even a snooze. After procuring the necessary visas for the Central American countries in Mexico City, we cycled south into Guatemala. It's a wonderful country because we climbed high into the mountains, which cooled the tropical heat and gave us an opportunity to learn a little bit about Guatemalan Indians and the influence of the Aztecs and the Mayans in the region.
That was just a warm-up for our travels through El Salvador, which became nothing more than a touring time trial. All day long, we would travel as far and as fast as we could. Since there was martial law at the time, we would have to put up in a hotel no later than 8 o'clock and not leave it before 7 o'clock. and then try to make our distance till the next town and hotel.
Our first day in El Salvador was very tense and in some ways exciting, as we were invited into a small town near the capital of San Salvador by a local cycling enthusiast. He organized us in a local hotel where we set up and showed us where we could catch a meal before the curfew. We didn't really have any idea, so as we were sitting around the restaurant having some frijoles or fritos and having one of the local San Salvadorian beers, the proprietor kept urging us to hurry. So leaving, he shut the door behind us, and we walked back to our hotel and noticed that there was an army truck parked in front of the hotel where we were staying. Some of the young soldiers spotted us and came over with their rifles lowered and told us to put our hands against the wall. And they brought us into the local captain, who, in the meantime, had almost shot the lock off the door, which was upsetting the proprietor to the hotel immensely. Once it was established that we weren't agents of some country in there to cause trouble, things were much more amicable between us, and they offered us cigarettes and asked if we might know their cousin Jose, who was living in New York City. It was 3 more days of similar military checks, which continued to take up valuable time as we were trying to get our 100 kilometers into the next village to duck out for the evening. But it gave us a really interesting perspective on the political climate in El Salvador in 1981. And really the bottom line was that the people were extremely tired of the conflict. The common man wanted no part of it and really wished that for everyone involved it would end. And we left El Salvador with a touch of sadness.
To envision a trip like this, you have to consider adventure. An adventure we found in southern Panama, where the road known as the Pan American Highway literally deteriorates down to a gravel track and then into bulldozer tracks and finally disappears completely in the dense jungle known as the Darien. Our trip through this jungle started south of Panama City, and within 100 kilometers we were down to the dirt paths of the Indian tribes.
The Indian children heard we were coming in to the villages often, and they would greet us at the edge of town yelling, "Monten, monten," which means ride, ride. But the jungle was so dense it was almost impossible to do much riding. And sometimes we were forced to hacking out a path with our machetes to proceed. It was one of the toughest sections of our trip. Every insect seemed to want a taste of our sweat. And at night we would hear jaguars roaring close to camp.
After 2 weeks in the Darien Gap, we were living on bananas and avocados. At one stage, while trying to escape from the swamps of the Atrato River, Peter and I had a real scare. We'd gone downriver in search of a boat, and when we returned to where we had left Tim and all our gear, they were gone, with only tracks leading into the water. Several hours later, we were reunited. Tim had hitched a ride on a passing boat, but in the ensuing madness had forgotten to leave us a note. That canoe ride places us at the start of the South American road system, where we began our long ride to Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Colombia is rugged and mountainous, and starting in the northern sections of the country on the Caribbean Sea, we crossed many of the three-fingered mountain range that blends into the main chain of the Andes in the country of Ecuador to the south. At one point, in the ups and downs of 7,000 vertical foot climbs, we clocked an exhilarating 68 miles per hour in a descent into the flatlands of Ecuador.
Following the western coast of South America, we rode the entire length of the desert areas of the west, the center section of which, called the Atacama, which is said to be the driest place on the planet. Some parts have never recorded rainfall since the Spanish first kept records in the 16th century. During this stretch, we were fighting the strong winds of the Humboldt Current, which comes up from Antarctica, blowing sometimes so strong it caused sand dunes to form in the road in front of us.
Perhaps one of the most unique aspects of our trip around the world is the degree of self-sufficiency Tim and I and Peter employed from the onset. One of those things was to make our lives as comfortable as possible.
We're essentially carrying on these bicycles, everything you'd normally have in a home, except for miniaturized, and a few extras. Like in this box I carry a voice recorder for recording my voice log, altimeter, compass, and whatnot, and my camera and some music gear down here. It's a office entertainment center of the bike.
Since we were going to be camping out 1,000 nights in our tents and preparing most of our own meals, an aspect to remain healthy, we developed our own kitchens, essentially. It has a stove, pots, pans, quality knives for preparing vegetables, and spices, which doesn't mean a lot on a day-to-day basis, but they do add up over a period of time. Of an evening, it's relaxing. Therapy in a way to sit down with a hot cup of tea and chop your onions and talk about the impressions that you'd had during the day. If you look at our camp, you can see that we're very comfortable. It's a lifestyle. We're, in a way, nomadic.
This is really a lifestyle to us at this point, not just a trip or a vacation. Certainly not a vacation.
We reached Buenos Aires, Argentina on October 20th of 1981, just almost 1 year from Jackson, Wyoming, and 11,000 miles on the saddles. From here, we spent the remaining of our funds on airplane tickets to South Africa.
Disembarking from the airplane in Cape Town, we began the long ride through Africa. It would take us along the garden route, Johannesburg, and then into Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya, before we'd arrive in Nairobi.
Arriving at Cape Town in South Africa was really a beautiful sight because we caught it just as the sun was rising on Table Mountain and got off the airplane and started cycling out of the airport. And at last we were on Africa, the dark continent, which I know the three of us had dreamed of since, childhood. Marlin Perkins and adventures and wild stories of animals and lions and tigers. Our travels in South Africa were extremely interesting and educational because we were there for almost 5 months before we actually left and crossed into Zimbabwe. But during that time, we realized we'd run out of money and spent a few months working in Johannesburg and just asking a lot of questions about the country.
Visa problems have always been a serious challenge for us, and our trip into Zambia was no less different. But solving this problem of having a 24-hour transit visa to ride 800 kilometers by going to the Office of Immigration and sorting through all the papers, showing that we'd actually made an application, resolved that, and allowed us to travel eastwards into Malawi. And Malawi is known as the warm heart of Africa. It was an amazing country, friendly people, plenty of services, and a feeling of pride about the country and the things they were doing, even if it was still only done with manual labor and hand tools. 5 days out of Dar es Salaam, we realized we'd taken a little gift with us, or rather Peter and Tim had carried a little gift with them, because they were stricken ill with malaria in the middle of nowhere. And for a week, I played the nurse while I watched them go through the entire cycle of malaria, freezing one half-an-hour section and then sweating out the next half an hour. But fortunately, we had the proper medicines, and they recovered, and we left once again, headed toward Mount Kilimanjaro in northern Tanzania.
We climbed to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro to celebrate Peter's 30th birthday on the summit. And then we spent another week roaming around the game parks, realizing what little wildlife is actually left in Africa before cycling on to Nairobi.
In Nairobi, we were faced with the difficult task of getting a visa for Ethiopia. Instead, we were forced to route through Uganda and into the southern Sudan. In Juba, we were stuck again, without a road and without any money. We worked for a French company while we waited for the road to open. But after a month, we were forced to take the ferry to Wad Medni.
Within a few days out of Khartoum, we were literally up to our axles in soft sand. We were very rarely able to ride the bicycles and had no choice but to walk and drag them along. They were heavy because we had a lot of food, and that was pretty difficult. Back in Khartoum, we had known that the Nubian Desert was out here. We'd met people there, known where we'd come from, and knew us. They didn't say much other than it's going to be a tough 620 miles to Wadi Halfa.
One thing Tim, Peter, and I have always tried to exemplify in our around-the-world expedition is perseverance. We could never really accomplish any of these goals or live the lifestyle we've lived without trying. Once, twice, but more likely 5, 10, or 15 times, and in as many different ways, before we'd actually admit that a program was no longer feasible.
There's an old British rail line that runs across the Nubian, and a train that runs back and forth once, twice a week. But that wasn't very appealing to us. We were a bicycle tour, and we were going to give the desert our best shot. We had our ideas out on the table and our minds were spinning.
The ensuing 10 days we spent in Shendi, we ended up with 2 very strange, ridiculous, and weird-looking contraptions. One was entitled the Bint el Nil, which means Daughter of the Nile, and the second one, Bint el-Sahara, which means daughter of the desert. What we had created was a series of welded angle iron joints, water pump bearings, rope, and a concoction of things basically found in junkyards that enabled our bicycle to travel on top of the rail. After a brief ceremony with our host, we set out. The first few days were incredible. We were like kids with a new toy as we sailed across the desert, and the biggest thrill was crossing those exposed railroad trestles. There you were, balanced on top of that thin piece of steel with nothing to keep you from falling off, only a little bit of luck and some backyard engineering. It was one of those moments that are magic to me now in retrospect. We were successful enough to cover the 750 kilometers to the town of Wadi Halfa, and we amused people along the rail line who happened to wander in and discover us in camp or see us cycling across the desert as the sun was setting.
After 18 days in the desert, we pulled into Wadi Halfa. We thought for sure at this point we'd made the journey until we saw a crowd gathering outside the station. At that point, we thought we were going to jail. But all they wanted to know was if the inspector in the village could ride our bicycles. Out of Africa, we hitched a ride on a military flight to Europe. In fact, we had to shave our beards to pass ourselves off as military personnel. It was just before midnight when we landed in Germany and cycled past the airfield sentry post. We had no idea where we were and no place to go.
When we got to Europe, we were flat broke after 2.5 years of traveling on the road. And so we started an odd jobs business, and we were doing everything from washing windows in Geneva to teaching ski lessons to some of the ambassadors up in the French Alps.
It was the spring of 1984 when we were finally ready to get back on the road again. The bicycles were in great shape, our equipment was all new or repaired, and we were just itching to get back to our lifestyle on the road.
We picked a route through Europe, starting at the Rock of Gibraltar, through Spain, France, back through Switzerland. Being the crazy mountain fanatics that we are, we chose to cycle up to one of the highest elevations in the Alps and incorporate as many of the most difficult mountain passes as possible. We traveled through the Dolomite region of Italy, down the Dalmatian coast in Yugoslavia. But it was crazy. In July and August, the roads are jammed with tourists from all over Europe, honking and beeping, all racing to their favorite spot, only to turn around and repeat it again a few days later. After that madness, even the chaotic city of Istanbul was a welcome relief. We stopped there to recondition our bikes and to check in on our visas for Saudi Arabia.
While in Istanbul, we worked on two of the most difficult bureaucracy hassles that we had come up against in this trip. One of them was to obtain a visa to cross Saudi Arabia, a very difficult project to undertake, and the other one was an ongoing attempt to obtain a Chinese visa to enter into Tibet and China, which was farther down the road.
While in Istanbul, we met with one of the more difficult diplomatic challenges of the entire trip, trying to obtain visas to ride across Saudi Arabia. No one had done it before. Visas had become a major problem, getting permission just to travel from one border to the next. Again, that too tired tour, never say die attitude prevailed, and we ended up with a very rare tourist visa by invitation of the Saudi Arabian Cycling Federation. We were probably the first foreign cycling group to go completely across Saudi Arabia overland.
The three of us rolled down the gangplank of the SS Karakoram onto the docks of Karachi, Pakistan's largest city. We then cycled up the fertile Indus River Valley, up towards the high country, then into Baluchistan along the Afghanistan frontier. The Pathan tribal people who live in this region have for centuries maintained a very special bond with their land. We had very interesting travels through this region, one village to the next, one man's home to the next, needing to ask permission as we traveled. We turned to the east at the bottom of the Khyber Pass, then to the capital city of Islamabad. While waiting for replies, we grew impatient and took a detour to the northern areas of Pakistan, bicycling over the Babusar Pass area and riding to Gilgit, and from there planning and setting off on a 30-day walking trek into the Karakoram Mountains to the base camp of K2, the second highest peak in the world. Upon our return to the city, we were faced with the reality that the Chinese weren't going to budge. So instead we charted a route along the southern edge of the Himalayas, through the Punjab and into northern India, and on to the capital city of New Delhi. It was a fantastic alternative to the China plans, and perhaps culturally even more fascinating. It also allowed us a very special visit in the Kingdom of Nepal. We reached Kathmandu in October of 1985.
The logistics needed to keep Two Tyred Tour on the road were put to a test in Kathmandu. We were pursuing our Chinese visa, and we were also building equipment in order to face the cold of the winter months in the Himalayan mountains. We found that when we were faced with such problems, our group was strongest when we pooled our talents. We found ever since we left on this trip that together we were a much stronger team than any of us could be individually.
After 3 exasperating months, we finally obtained our visas to enter China. And although it was the middle of the winter, we weighed the possibilities of waiting for spring to set off, but decided against it with the fickle nature of the Chinese bureaucracies, a potential stopping point for us. So we set off on January 3rd of 1986.
And there's been a few times, such as crossing Tibet in the middle of the winter, where we needed a lot more cold weather gear, and we were carrying food up for 2 weeks worth of food. And I think our bicycles then were weighing around 165 pounds, which is more than my own body weight.
In the first 5 days, we did what must be one of the greatest climbs of any road in the world. Setting out from the Sankosi River Valley at 1,500 feet, we climbed for days up and up the river valley systems and over the Tongla Pass, 16,600 feet. From there, our view of the Himalayas in winter was incredible.
Lhasa, the forbidden capital of Tibet, is an incredible place, primarily because of the splendid views of the ancient Potala Palace, the seat of the Dalai Lama, and the Jokang Temple, the most revered place for the Tibetan Buddhists, but also for cultures in collision, with Chinese architecture contrasting against the Tibetan, with people milling on the streets. It's a view that will always remain in my heart.
We arrived in Lhasa at the end of January, and a most auspicious time. It was the beginning of the Monlan Chenmo, a Tibetan festival for world peace, many centuries old. The Chinese had forbidden this event from taking place, and here we were seeing it for the first time in nearly 2 decades.
The river valleys were lush and fertile and full of people. We were traveling through distinct climatic zones, starting in soft sand in the valleys and climbing to pine-covered hillsides and eventually to snow-covered passes. The river valley narrowed into a gorge. The road was almost hanging on the edge of a cliff, crossing small drainages that led to 19,000-foot peaks. Our vulnerability was magnified by its immense scale. Climbing in soft mud between snowbanks and rivulets of icy waters is quite an experience, and we did this for 10 miles. At 15,000 feet, 2 miles from the summit, the water turned to ice and we were forced to walk the last section, having to work our way around several trucks stuck in the one-lane road. We started cycling downward in the muddy tracks. On the 3rd day after our descent, we encountered a 6-wheeled truck overturned by an avalanched hillside. It took the 3 of us to maneuver each bicycle across the enormous road slide. At a crucial point, a slide started. We flew in different directions, narrowly averting disaster.
For 5 months of traveling in Tibet, we entered the Yunnan province in the southwestern part of China. We made our way to the capital city there to extend our visas, which were now 2 months overdue. The Chinese officials would have nothing to do with this and escorted us to the airport and put us on the next plane to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is, I think, the busiest city in the world, and after cycling through the remote parts of China, I must admit we were thoroughly confused by the noise, the people, and the lights. From Hong Kong, our only route choice was to fly to Bangkok. We started down the coast of Thailand, stopping off on the beaches to recover. Tibet had taken its toll on all 3 of us. It was 4:30 in the morning when we finally cleared customs. At long last, we were in Australia, our 6th continent, and in the western capital of Perth.
3 weeks later, we were out on the road again, getting used to the rigors of cycling and working out the logistics to cross the infamous Nullarbor Plain. We weren't really quite sure what we would encounter. It was easy enough to look at the map and to see that it was 200 miles sometimes between towns, but that really wasn't the difficulty. More of it would just be the wind and the weather. It was, in fact, supposedly beginning of summer, which meant extremely hot temperatures during the day. That might be difficult to deal with. We crossed the Nullarbor without incident and arrived in South Australia. And once back in the throes of civilization, as the Australians would like to think, we continued on to Sydney, arriving there on the 1st of December 1986 to complete our around-the-world tour.
The idea of leaving on this trip was a hope at a grand adventure, a unique chance to see the world from the seat of a bicycle and to experience it on the sun's time and nature's terms.
I think it's been curiosity that has made me a traveler ever since I was young. And the idea of going by bicycle has always seemed the best way to interact with people. You go slow enough, you see everything. You don't go all over the place, but where you do go, you get a very close look at it.
This 6.5 years traversing the Earth's surface has been an immense education. There are so many bits and pieces of information I now understand. When I read about the strife in Central America or the starvation in Sudan, it is not just an intellectual response, but it is also an emotional one. I feel that I know these people, their dreams and their fears. Hopefully this will allow me to exercise a greater degree of responsibility, if in no other way, to live my politics.
I feel a mixture of emotions returning to the United States. I feel some sadness at the end of such a fantastic adventure now coming to its final moments. I also feel excitement and pride in the ability of the three of us to stay together as a group, to work together to solve our problems and to actually complete so very closely our originally planned route around the world.
The most amazing part of our trip was seeing our families. Our brothers and sisters had grown, had married, some had children, and our parents were 6.5 years older. But one of the things that struck me the most was the degree of support and the love that I was given, not only because I'd successfully completed a goal, but primarily because I was still part of the family.
And I believe that the things we've learned in the world will help us in whatever types of pursuits we set off from this point. And we take a positive view of the world back with us, and that's a very refreshing thing. The idea that there's cooperation in the world, an underlying current of helpfulness that the people have. A fantastic experience, a fantastic friendship with two men, bonds that are as great as brotherhood, really.
I realize that probably for the rest of my life, I'll be looking back at these days that I'm still living out the last few, as maybe the best days. I'll always be going, boy, those were the days.